Welcome back, everyone. And here we are on the next to the last topic in our bioethics series within the Master of Cell and Molecular Biology at St. Thomas University. And today we're looking at transplantation. And then hopefully on Friday, we'll take a look at the COVID-19 pandemic, all right? A little bit, still a work in progress. All right, any questions or comments from previous? All right, so let's look at transplantation then, which can have some bioethical issues. It's a little bit of historical background on transplantation. Of course, medicine has advanced tremendously today to the point that most transplants, organ transplants, are successful. But it used to be just a few decades back that most organ transplants were not successful. And the recipient typically only expanded the lifespan for a few years. And there were mostly experimental procedures. Talk about vital organs. Of course, non-vital organs have been transplanted for a longer period of time. Even bone marrow transplant, for example, is a type of organ transplant. Has been going on for longer, and also corneas of the eye and so forth. But vital organs is more recent and successful. A lot has to do with a better understanding of the immune system and immunosuppressants and how to manage the patient, the recipient, precisely for the immune system of the recipient to not kill that organ, because the organ is seen as a foreign body by the body itself, all right, a foreign object. Okay, so that's just very, very brief. And because of that, even in principle of bioethics, there was a shift that occurred possibly about 40, 50 years ago in looking at vital organs more from a functional point than a structural point of view, all right? Because structurally, of course, they are what they are, but functionally, especially the example that I'll be using throughout is mostly kidney, because it's the one that is most needed right now, and also is the one that is most easy to donate, not only cadaveric, but living. Mm-hmm. And if we look functionally or structurally at kidneys, of course, there's two, and each one is a vital organ. So there's kind of a dead-end argument there on how to excise a vital organ, from a living person. It's considered mutilation of a vital organ, which in principle would not be acceptable ethically. But if we look at it functionally, it turns out that our vital organs, our paired vital organs, can actually substitute for each other. There's a certain level of redundancy there, and particularly with the kidney, so that one kidney is functionally sufficient to keep the person alive. And people who are born with one kidney, for example, and they live a normal lifestyle, right? And so by looking at vital organs functionally instead of structurally, it gave an opening bioethically to be able to say yes, as long as other provisions are in place, in principle, to transplantation of vital organs, okay? Especially, again, when I'm looking at living donations, living donation of vital organs. All right, so like I pointed out here in the first slide, for organ transplantation, it's either cadaveric or living donation, right? And they're not, the difference is not insignificant in the sense that for the recipient, for the patient receiving the organ, in general, living organs live twice as long as cadaveric organs. Okay. In other words, receiving from a cadaver, even if the transplant is done very fast, within a few hours, because it involves typically major surgery, again, on the part of the recipient, whether it's heart, liver, lung, kidney, you name it, it's major surgery. So that surgery is going to take several hours, not only extracting the organ, but putting it into the recipient, right? And the average window is about 24 hours, more or less, whether it's living or cadaveric. But particularly in cadaveric organs, within 24 hours of death is the window of opportunity. But as soon as the person dies, then the vital organs begin to suffer. They begin to die also. Necrosis sets in at the cellular level at different levels. But that organ is not the optimal organ any longer, all right? And so that's the general advantage of living organs, is that they tend to last, on average, twice as long as the cadaveric. Eventually, all transplanted organs, just like any organ that is our own, is going to fail sooner or later. We know that. All right, so just some initial definitions here, just a few, to be on the same page, as it were. It can be an autograft or an allograft, or a xenotransplantation, meaning from another species. But autograft or autologous transplantation is a self-donation, and that is more common with stem cells, right? Adult stem cells, autologous adult stem cell transplant, but it can also happen with other, for example, skin and so forth, from one part of the body to another, where there has been extensive skin damage in burns and things like that, all right? So self-transplantation has the big advantage that there's no immune rejection. But as soon as we go away from that, which is a limited source of transplantations that can be done, right? Then allograft, which is the most common one, there is the whole issue of immune rejection, right? Because even though we're talking about the same species, definitely because of the fingerprinting in genotype, the fact that all our genotypes have their particular personalized details, then there's going to be an immune rejection. It's considered essentially a foreign body, okay? And the body of the donor will treat that organ as a foreign body and attack it and eventually kill it, destroy it. So that can be dealt with immunosuppressors and so forth. I'll get into that. But basically, that's the category there. Allogeric or allografts can be either from a living or a cadaveric donor. And then xenotransplantation is using organs from other animals. The one that is most common to this day, I believe, is still the heart valve from pigs, which seems to be very similar, the pig heart to the human. And so the valves are used. Of course, all that is stripped of as much tissue as possible so that the immune rejection is minimal, right? Because you can imagine with a xenotransplantation, then the incompatibility is going to be even greater, right? We're just basically at the level of mammals, and that's it with the other species. All right. Moving forward then, just to review the vital organs that, the organs that are vital and that are possible candidates for transplantation will be the heart, the kidney, the liver, the lung, the pancreas, intestine, thymus gland, and the most common, the three most common are the kidney, the liver, and the heart, all right? Now living are kidney, liver, and lung, but not heart. Except for, there's an exception. There's a very interesting exception when one can actually receive a living heart. And the other person, the donor, keeps on living, because obviously if we extract a living heart from a normal patient, that's going to kill that patient, right? But how does that other patient, how does the donor keep on living by donating a heart? That's one shot, you know, but no, it's a different way. You'll see it's a very creative way of doing a double transplant of heart, kidney, heart, lung together, heart, lung together as an ensemble. You'll see it's very creative and really neat. Anyway, for living organs then, paired like the kidney. One can donate a kidney and keep on living as a donor. And obviously the recipient can live with one kidney. The liver, it turns out we actually have 3 lobes in the liver, right? 3 lobes. So one can donate 1 lobe and still live with the 2. In fact, the liver regenerates, has a lot of stem cells and has a lot of regeneration power. The liver does. So one can donate a liver of the lobe and keep on living as a donor. And the recipient, I guess, can live with 1 liver, with 1 lobe. Will have to watch their diet and so forth, greases and fats and everything, but they can live. Then the lung, turns out we have 5 lungs. You know, they talk about functionally 5 lungs. In other words, we have 5 lobes. We have 3 lobes on one side, 2 lobes on the other. I forget which is which, but the fact is that we have a total of 5 lobes. And one can donate, so a person can live with 2 lobes. Of course, they're going to live a very sedentary life, right? They're not going to run the marathon or anything like that, but they can live a sedentary life, maybe even with oxygen support, but they can live with 2 lobes, minimum. And so the lung donation from the living perspective would be, we can donate 1 lobe, and functionally, it's okay. We can live with 4 lobes, pretty much the same lifestyle, all right? So we can donate 1 of the 5 lobes and still be fine. We have to obviously be in good health, but that's a general premise that applies for all living organ donors. They have to be in good health to donate, all right? One can donate 1 lung. So for the lung, living lung transplant, the recipient needs to get 2 donors, each one donor to give him or her a lobe, which complicates matters with regards to the immune system and so forth. But anyway, it's doable in principle. For example, the 2 donors could be 2 identical twins. So you have to deal with 1 type of immune rejection and so forth. Or there could be siblings of the recipient, of the patient, which also diminishes the incompatibility, right? It makes for a better match. Okay, so we're still at the big picture here of what organs can be donated, including living organs. Now, tissues also, tissue transplantation. It's a broader spectrum because we can donate our transplantation of bone, bone marrow, tendons, cornea, skin, heart valves, nerves, veins, stem cells. Okay, and the most common are the cornea and muscle or skeletal, including tendons and ligaments. Those are the most common tissue donations. The good thing about tissue donation is it can be frozen. And so it lasts longer. The window is a bigger window, all right? And when they can be frozen, they can also be banked and find a better match and so forth, because there are national registries for this. Whereas with organ donations, they have to be fresh, of course. They cannot be frozen yet. All right, so the average window is about 24 hours. Okay, let's move forward and look at the issue of the rejection with the immune response. And so there's a matching scale. The matching scale is not all or none, like a light switch, all right? It's not either accept or reject. Rather, there's a range. There's a range. And the one I'm more familiar with is kidney, which the range is like 4, from 1 to 4. And the closer to 4, the better match. But like a 2.5 or something like that already is a good match for donation. It doesn't have to be perfect 100%. It can be like above 50, 60% match. That's good enough. And then the immunosuppressors will take care of the rest, right? So what they do is a serotype to determine what is the immunocompatibility of the donor and recipient, again, whether living or cadaveric, right? And then the immunosuppressant drugs will be adjusted according to that. And what they do is a PRA score, or panel reactive antibody, all right? So it's known as a PRA score, panel reactive antibody level. So a low PRA is the best, right? And the high PRA means that the patient, the recipient, has been sensitized already. And they can be sensitized in a number of ways, either by having previous transplants or transfusions, which technically is a transplant, right, of the liquid organ of the blood, or pregnancy also because of the maternal-fetal interchange that occurs, the dynamics that intercur. You know that it's known now that even cells go back and forth, cells from the fetus going to the mother and cells of the mother going to the fetus, and they're actually incorporated into each other's body and tissue, all right? They're a small amount, but they're there. So all that has an impact on the immune system, and these various categories tend to have a higher PRA score and therefore are more sensitive to transplantation. All right. Okay, at any rate, so these immunosuppressant drugs are really fine-tuned, but generally they have to take them for a lifetime. Except in another advantage of the living donation, something that is also creative now, has been done. I think it's still experimental, but I heard about it a few years ago in the UK. What they did was, it was a kidney transplant, and before doing the actual kidney transplant, they transplanted bone marrow of the donor to the recipient, so that that bone marrow of the donor to the recipient would generate the antibodies of the donor, where the kidney was going to come from, all right, and integrate into the recipient's antibodies and become its own antibody system, part of its own system. So that the idea, the principle was that with this extra set of antibodies, the recipient's body would not consider that kidney a foreign body, will recognize it as self and not other. So it's a pretty creative idea. But before they did that, what they do is they strip the recipient of their immune system. They shut down their own immune system, okay? And then they do the bone marrow transplant. And so the new antibodies that are coming up are from the transplant, from that bone marrow, which is pretty interesting. Huh? I don't know. I have really not done the follow-up on it, but I just heard the blip of the news and I thought it was a pretty creative idea. Like I said, I think still experimental, but to me it has a lot of potential, right? And it may be a question of tweaking it. And minimally, it will give a heightened acceptance of the organ. Maybe not at still 100%, but the immunosuppressants may have to be very, very few. All right, so what's the idea? It just has that caveat that before the actual bone marrow donation, so it involves then two donations, right? Before the kidney, it involves bone marrow donation, which can also be given. Typically, they take it out of the hip bone here, the os, or the hood of the hip, or somewhere around there. Okay, it's the most accessible marrow. But anyway, I thought it was very creative, and it's a field, it's a growing field. Now, here's another creative idea that was done just to prove the principle that can be done is domino transplants, all right? Domino transplant is to try to find the best match. The simplest transplant for domino is to have two pairs, right? If you consider, let's see, I used to have a diagram around here. I think I sent an older PowerPoint. I realize now I had improved this with a few more slides, but basically think about it for a moment. We got two sets of donor recipients, right? Set A and B. So we got donor A and recipient A, and then we got donor B and recipient B. But donor A and recipient A are not a match, and the B set is not a match either, all right? They're not, but they are a cross match, so that recipient B is a match with donor A. And recipient A is a match with donor B, all right? So it's kind of a cross. It is a cross, called a cross match. So what they do is donor A ends up donating to recipient B, and donor B ends up donating to recipient A. The end result is that both recipients get their organ, but they get the best match organ, which is not the person who's going to donate to them. The downside is more at the psychological level. That, for example, once recipient B gets his or her organ from donor A, then maybe donor B will walk away and not donate and leave the other recipient waiting, you know, on the sidelines, because their couple already got the vital organ that they needed. Okay, so it's a psychological thing, and you never know how people are going to react to this. So bottom line is that when this is cross-match donation, all 4 surgeries are done at the same time. So nobody walks away. They're all under anesthesia. They're all done simultaneously. And you can imagine the theater, you know, you need 4 surgical theaters that are adjacent to each other, because these organs literally, physically have to be transplanted and transported from one surgical theater to the next, all right? And so needless to say, they need to occur in the same hospital, et cetera, and all simultaneously. But that's the simplest of these domino transplants to find the best match, all right? One that is more involved is to do them sequentially. And that's very risky again, because at any point, any donor can pull out once the recipient gets the transplant from a previous donor. But this one, so here's one case of a type of domino transplant that allows for a living heart to be transplanted. Okay, it's a particular case with cystic fibrosis, because cystic fibrosis needs the lungs. So cystic fibrosis, as you know, is a degenerative congenital illness that develops thick mucus that accumulates in the lungs, in the alveoli, and they cover them, and the person has increasing difficulty in breathing, and eventually they basically asphyxiate to death. They can't breathe because of the thick mucus. They have to be aspirated all the time and so forth. It's very debilitating, and they have a short lifespan. So they need both lungs, but their heart is healthy, all right? So CF only affects the lungs, specifically as vital organs. Their heart is healthy of a CF patient. You'll see why that's important. So typical donation is from a cadaver. It's a cadaveric donation. But it turns out that functionally, it's easier to transplant heart and lung together as a unit than to only transplant the lungs, because you have to cut fewer vessels and then anastomose fewer vessels also. Let's look for a moment at the heart-lung circulation. Which is that other circulation. It's not the systemic circulation, and it's the one that we're kind of a little less familiar with. But this one is more back. Okay, so here's a full circulation. Is that large enough? You can see it. This has both this has, you hear cardiologists and people in blood talk about the 2 circulations, right? The 2 circulations. One is the systemic circulation going to the body, right? Represented here by the 2 capillaries. This one you can consider going to this is arterial circulation, right? Coming out of the body, which for systemic circulation, that blood is oxygenated blood, represented in red. And this one is also systemic, these 2, okay? So coming out of the aorta and branching out into all of the capillaries of the body. and then doing the gas exchange, picking up the CO2, releasing oxygen, and coming back through venous circulation, vena cava, anterior and inferior vena cava, into the atrium, ventricle, and so forth. And then it goes into the pulmonary circulation. So this one is the pulmonary circulation, okay? Which is that other circulation. Now, a couple of little mnemonics here to remember which are arteries and which are veins and which pump blood out and which in. Think of arteries and veins in capital letters. A, capital A, is like an arrow pointing out. So arteries pump out blood from the heart. Don't think of oxygen or CO2 blood, because that's going to get you messed up in the two circulations. Just think of blood going out of the heart or going into the heart. So coming out of the heart is out, is an arrow out. So arteries pump blood out of the heart. So this would be the aorta, and this is a pulmonary artery going to the lungs, the pulmonary circulation. Veins, capital V, is pointing in, you know, and even lowercase e, vein, V is pointing in. So veins bring blood into the heart, all right? So you get the vena cavas here, and you have, where is it? It's in the background. You can't see them here, or you can see one here, which is double. This would be the pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins bringing blood into the heart, right? And the blood is going into the atrium to be pumped to the ventricle, or squished into the ventricle, and then through systole pump out. Now, the pulmonary circulation, right, which is going to carry CO2 blood to the lungs. CO2 blood to the lungs. I would say here you have arteries, the pulmonary arteries carrying CO2 blood. So don't associate artery with oxygenated blood. In the pulmonary circulation, it's backwards, but there's still arteries coming out of the heart. And the pulmonary veins coming from the lungs back into the heart are oxygenated blood, because the exchange has already happened, the opposite exchange in the lungs, opposite to the capillaries in the rest of the body, all right? At any rate, that pulmonary circulation, as you can see, has, if we were to just transplant the lungs for a CF patient, we need to cut both pulmonary arteries, right? And all 4 pulmonary veins. That's a total of 6 major tubing, all right? Whereas if we transplant the whole set, the unit of heart and lung together, we only have to cut actually the aorta and the vena cavas, so 3. The anterior and inferior vena cava, you know, and the aorta. And then we maintain the pulmonary circulation intact, lungs and heart. And it's an easier surgery. It's an easier surgery. But what happens? In the CF patient, right, he only needs, or she only needs, the lungs. So, and certainly that CF patient cannot function with 2 hearts. So his own heart or her own heart of the CF patient is now extra and has to be excised, because that patient is getting the whole chest set of heart and lungs, everything between the ribs. So here is a heart that is living. It does come from a cystic fibrosis patient, but that heart is intact. That heart doesn't have cystic fibrosis, because that's a idiopathic specific to the lungs. All right. So here is a living heart that is available, healthy, can go to a heart patient. All right. And so that's the one case where you can have actually a living heart transplantation, but it's not that common. And anyway, that was done in, I have here 2016 at Stanford. So it has been done, and it's interesting that one can get a living heart under these particular conditions. Much more common is the domino kidney, all right? Because like I say, the kidneys, since they're paired, and we can actually live with one kidney, normal lifestyle, as long as that one kidney is still healthy, then the living donation can be done sequentially to try to find the best match. There are registries, I'll go into the registries in a minute, that are nationwide, both on the side of the patient, of the recipient, and on the side of the donor, for the essentially the PRA scores, okay, the immunocompatibility. And these are registries that are databases on data banks, and these computers are constantly 24-hour a day working on finding the best match across the country. Right. So this is one that was done. Well, the one that I described, the simplest one, is that double set, the two sets of A and B, right? But here is one that is, that I know the most challenging today. 30 donors and 30 recipients. It's just way out of the scale, okay? This was done in 2012. There may be one that's more recent. I don't know, I haven't checked it, frankly, in a couple of years. But this started back in California with a fellow who was in a yoga class, and someone else told him that a friend needed a kidney. So this fellow thought about being a donor. You know, he was healthy and so forth, and he figured that would be a good cause. So he could donate and start that domino reaction, all right? It involved, the whole big picture of it involved 30 donors and 30 recipients nationwide. I think it took about 3 months to do the whole thing. There were a number of hospitals involved, but 17 hospitals involved in all this throughout the whole US. 4 months. Took 4 months to complete it all. But it was done. In other words, this registry lined up the 30 best matches between living donors and living recipients who were obviously anonymous to each other, unknown to each other, but they were all willing to participate in this experiment. And it went forward, they did it. There's a site here where you can read the news, okay? And the big challenge, of course, along that whole thing, because it took 4 months to complete all this, is what if any of the donors pulls out of the protocol once their recipient, you know, their loved one, got the kidney already from the previous donor. Because not everyone, of course, has the same value system or the same motivation or the same commitment and so forth. It's a big to-do, right, to donate a kidney. And so they may have said, someone may have said along the way, well, now my friend or my spouse or my sibling, whatever, already got his or her kidney, so I'm pulling out. And it's a voluntary thing. No one is being forced here. And it almost happened along the way, as I remember reading the article, it almost happened. One of the donors started having second thoughts about it. But thanks be to God, he was encouraged and convinced to continue and to do the right thing, and he did. And then it completed the whole protocol. So 30 patients got living kidneys from 30 donors, all right? And the donors kept on living because they were all healthy and could pass the rigor of donating. So I thought that was amazing to think that this could be organized. Of course, they wanted to prove the principle, you know, take it to the extreme that it could be done. I mentioned this also because, I don't know if I have somewhere. Okay, so this is the back, the simplest. Now, what I want to mention is that I'm emphasizing kidney because it's at the same time the most needed organ and the most easy to donate, all right? Right now in the US, there's about 100,000 people waiting for a kidney on the list, on the registry, all right, on the transplant waiting list, 100,000. And I've heard that about 15 die every day for lack of a kidney. It's just too late. Wore out the dialysis machine, can't take it anymore. So, I mean, that's pretty significant, 15 dying every day. And yet, like I'm saying, a living donation would solve that problem. One time I did the math, if we take just the adult population of the United States, right, just the adult population, figure out what percentage of the US population would need to donate a kidney to wipe out that 100,000. It was less than 0.1%. Less than 0.1% of the adult population in the US could totally wipe out that waiting list. Okay. So it's a very small, it's not even 1%, 1/10 of 1%. It's just amazing. So anyway, focusing a little bit on the kidneys. These, yeah, here we go. These are the two agencies that are in charge of the registry of organs in the United States. Also because, you see, this leads itself to possible fraud and money exchange and other services or goods and services exchange, right? Because a person who is either on dialysis or some other life-saving machine, and if they're a person of means, they may be willing to pay for an organ, right? And we know that there is human organ trafficking and so forth. There's an institute here at St. Thomas University in the School of Law that is tracking all that, and they have workshops. It's associated, sadly, it's very associated with human trafficking. And so there's a dark side of this whole field that is very, very dark indeed. And therefore, it needs to be regulated. And to maintain organ donations as a voluntary thing, whether it's cadaveric or living, and not for sale. So there was an act by Congress done in the 1980s, right, 84, that is called the National Organ Transplant Act, NOTA. That's the acronym. And so in this act by Congress, basically these two agencies were established at the national level: the Organ Procurement Transplantation Network, also known as OPTN, and the United Network for Organ Sharing, known as UNOS or UNOS, all right? And these two agencies are separate and distinct also because they have different responsibilities. The OPTN is the one basically that maintains the registry of those who need organs, all right? Those who are on the list. Whereas the organ sharing UNOS is the one that allocates the organs. In other words, this is the one that is tracking the donors, whether they are living or cadaveric. But the thing is that these two agencies are in constant communication, and their databases are constantly trying to find the best match. It's a dynamic system, because at any given time of day or night, people will go on and off of this registry, right? For example, someone going on kidney failure, well, they're going to go on the OPTN list. And someone who has just died and had on their license, for example, that they were organ donors, well, immediately that person is going to go on the UNOS list and so forth, and try to find that best match, okay? So The idea is that the best match is found nationwide, and then typically it is the organ that is transported over to the recipient, the patient, wherever the patient is. And in that hospital, typically it's a county hospital, doesn't have to be, it could be a private hospital, but the main one here in Dade County is Jackson Memorial. It's the transplant center. Okay. More and more hospitals are getting into transplantation as it's becoming more standard protocol. It typically has to be a large hospital with a lot of support system. So it stands to reason that each organ has particular criteria, either for collecting or for allocating and transportation and so forth. But generally, they are transported, as you see in the movies, in a cooler with ice, not dry ice, because it will burn the tissue, just regular ice, you know, in a rush from one place to another. It could be across town, it could be from city to city or from state to state, depends. So the whole idea is to try to get that organ to the recipient as quickly as possible. And I mentioned there's the registry and there's a list and a waiting list that typically involves years. I'm going to mention the case of two patients that I know who are friends of mine. One was a heart patient. We're contemporaries, more or less. He's originally from Colombia, married to a Mexican lady, and we're friends for many years. He had a heart condition and he was down to about 10% of his heart, 10%. He was horrible. This fellow, they have a little townhouse down in Homestead, and it would take them practically half a day to come down the stairs. And then another half a day to go back up the stairs. That's all he could do in one day. You know, it was exhausting. It would take him hours literally to just walk a few steps up and down. So stressful. To fast forward, he had 2 attempts at transplantation, but he ended up saying no because it wasn't really a best match. And finally, the 3rd time he got a call over a period of time, he has actually 10 years on the waiting list, on the heart waiting list, 10 years in a very, very sedentary life. And the wife was like a nurse to him day and night, 24/7, the cooking, everything. Finally, one day in the middle of the night, one night, typically comes at night, I don't know why, they get the call from Jackson Memorial that they have a good heart for him. 17-year-old who had just died. Typically it's a trauma to the head, fatal trauma to the head. And the classical case is a motorcycle fellow that flies out into open air, you know. And so he gets the call, 2 a.m., says, this is a very good match for you. It's a 17-year-old heart, in very good shape and so forth. You're a good match. And this is practically your last chance because you've rejected 2 other ones before. So basically make your decision within a few minutes and get on over here. So they did. They just packed it and went to Jackson. He got the heart. I'll tell you a few more details about that because it's amazing how the drama develops. But let me stop for a moment for a question or a comment.
I just wanted to know right now, what determines whether they can just harvest an organ from deceased, like in a situation like that?
Yeah, it has to be. So we have what is known as the opt-in system. All right, I'll talk about opt-in or opt-out later. But basically, we have to state somewhere that we are organ donors.
So that's that person, that 17-year-old?
Yeah, he was an organ donor. Yeah, he was an organ donor. And it's kind of, to me, it's a little incongruent in that you have these motorcycle riders. Sometimes I hear them on the expressway precisely in the middle of the night running. Oh, you hear the motorcycles all the way from the Golden Gate interchange all the way down to Dadeland and back and so forth, you know. And, but ironically, a number of them are also organ donors. I guess it's kind of a fashion for them to be organ donors because it's the thrill, right? At least if I go, I'll give someone else, I'll donate life to someone else in the process. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Open here, right? But yeah, that's the case. But it has to be stated. In other words, unless we have stated somehow that we're organ donors, they have hands off. You know, they cannot. And if we don't state it personally, then the proxy can do that. And that's precisely those forms that we talked about. Okay. The living will. In the living will, one can specify that one wants to be an organ donor, and then the proxy can say, well, they wanted it this way, so go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Another little detail that happened to my friend, imagine. So he had, before the surgery, for years, he had a pacemaker to help him with the heart, all right, which are actual wires that go in to the heart to stimulate it. And for some reason in the surgery, I guess it's a bloody surgery, right? One of the little wires was left in. It was not spotted. It was not taken out. Just one little wire. And that one little wire started rubbing against the aorta of the new heart. And he started bleeding internally. And it's a good thing he was still in the recovery, because I think the recovery was like 5 or 6 days or something like that in the recovery unit, all right? Step down and so forth. But he had tubes for taking out fluid from the chest cavity. And one of the nurses noticed that about 5 days into the recovery, after the surgery, very successful, everything else, the fluid's coming out with fresh blood, very red blood, all right? And so that was a big alert. And this nurse, thanks be to God, was right on it. So she alerted the heart surgeon. They had to wheel him in, open him up again right away, and take out this one little wire that had made its way through the aorta and was causing a massive hemorrhage inside his chest right after the heart surgery. It's incredible. So he actually lived twice in a week. And so after that, the second surgery, 5 days later, they reopened where they had closed up and everything else, you know, take out the clamps. And he went through another bout of recovery and did fine. Did fine, thanks be to God. The second time he pulled through. So really, this nurse saved his life by watching that observation of a sign, right? But a few months later, it's been about 3 years, I guess, that it's a transplant now, but 3 years. And already a couple months after the transplant, with some other friends we went to visit down in Homestead, and he said, "Father, look what I can do." And he started dancing the cumbia. Now, as a Colombian, right? If he had danced the cumbia just for 1 or 2 minutes before, he would have dropped dead right there. With a 10% heart, you just can't do that. So we all laugh crazy. And he's doing fine, thanks be to God. But that's a successful heart transplant, all right, from a cadaver. With regards to, oh yeah, I want to point out this target donation. Target donation is that the recipient finds a donor. This is for living organs, particularly the kidney, but it can also be, liver or lungs, okay? If the patient and the recipient on life support can find a donor to donate to them specifically, they can bypass the waiting list. And that's called target donation, targeted donation. And typically it's some family member, the parents, the siblings, all right, or the children, adult children of the patient. And so that's the typical scenario. It's called targeted donation, and it bypasses the waiting list. So they could be toward the bottom where they have to wait 2, 3, 4 years. But if they get someone to donate to them specifically, they bypass the list. In Europe, in general, this doesn't work. In other words, with a target donation, it does help the patient in some way, but it doesn't bypass the waiting list. In other words, if the patient finds a donor, then that donor donates into the pool, which moves the patient up the list just by default because someone else is getting the organ, all right? but it doesn't exonerate them from the waiting list. And that's one of the differences between market economy medicine that we have in the US and socialized medicine over there. In other words, in the socialized medicine, it's fine if you get a donor, but that donor has to donate into the pool, not to you specifically, so you're still on the list. All right, it may move the list forward, right, because someone else is getting the donation. Anyway, those are some differences there. Let me see what else I have.
There's stories from Europe where the travel to a different, they come to America or they
Yeah.
find a backyard,
Yeah.
back alley doctor to do the transplant so we can
Right.
stuff or something.
Yeah, I'll talk about that here in the last slide, which is part of Transplant Tourism. All right, it's called Transplant Tourism, and it's all set up. It's amazing. It's yeah, very sad what's happening, but very real. I'll get to that in a minute. Living donor, yeah. Oh yes, so here you see why the whole issue of total brain death, right? It was important to have that total brain death accepted so that we don't end up pulling living organs from a person who is not total brain, right? Partial brain death would not qualify because they may still have a beating heart and breathing lungs. Now, this is another little thing here, that the vital organs can be kept alive inside the cadaver. So once we have a declaration of brain death, right? We have a declaration, official declaration of brain death. We no longer have a person as such. We have now a cadaver. And that cadaver now can be put on support system to keep the vital organs alive. But, and that's typically the case of brain death, we're not keeping the brain alive because the brain is dead, but we keep him from the neck down, a support system for the heart, lungs, etc. They heparinize the person and so forth, so the blood doesn't coagulate as fast, and is just a window, all right, but it's to keep those organs alive until the match is found and all the bureaucracy and paperwork and matching is done to get the organs. So to try to maximize the health of those organs of the person who has just died. But I have to be very careful here that we no longer have a person, we have a cadaver, but it looks like as if they're asleep on a vent and so forth, okay? Yeah, a living cadaver, organically speaking and physiologically, but not the brain. The brain is dead. So that's why I say we don't only have a person as such. The principle of integration is dead. All right, let me see. All right, let me finish this part. Determination of brain death, right? Talked about. Informed consent also, especially for cadaveric donors. It can be proxy, but this is another way that we can help our relatives and friends when they're trying to decide once we're dead. And the transplant team will approach, which will be a different team from the one that's declaring the person dead, all right? But the transplant team may approach the proxy. Do you know if your loved one wanted to donate their organs or not? There's nothing written, there's nothing on the license, so they always make the approach. If the dead person qualified, and then the proxy has to decide. But if there's no background, it's very difficult for the proxy, and typically the proxy decides against donation. That's the classical. But if there has been some indication from the person who was ill, then it's much easier for the proxy to make that decision, whether they're family or friends, all right? That's why I'm saying consider at least a living will, and on that other part, that's where one would state, I want to be an organ donor. All right, so payment versus altruistic, this has been discussed over the years in bioethics, and the long and short is that invariably we come out with no payment because it's fairly easy to see. If we start putting payment into the thing, then it lends itself for a lot of manipulation. And it sets right away a big chasm between those who have and those who don't have, those who can pay, those who cannot pay, and what will they do to get what they want, all right? So in most countries of the world, it's still altruistic. And yet, we know that there's a black market, which is huge on this. And typically, it preys, P-R-E-Y, it preys on poor populations, right? Poor populations of the world, where they will actually pay people and people will give. Again, the big thing is the kidney. They will go into typically the southern hemisphere somewhere, and they will pay young people $500, $1,000 for a kidney, which in that part of the world could be a big thing, could be 10 or 20 years earnings, right? And if after all I can continue living with a kidney, why not? And they will do the operation, the surgery with the best of the medical science available, but they're paying, all right? They're paying for these kidneys, and it basically tends to predate on poor people. Just like with the case of the IVF and the eggs and the surrogate motherhood and all those things that we've talked about. All right. So this has given rise to what is known today as transplantation tourism. And as Karim was mentioning, transplantation tourism involves the people who can actually pay this. Not only will they buy the organ from another part of the world, whether it's a kidney or a liver leaving the donor alive, or a heart leaving the donor dead, all right? But they'll pay, and they'll also pay for the medical team to go with them into another country and set up, typically in a hotel room, they will set up a surgical theater inside that hotel room, sterilize the whole place, bring all of the equipment that they need, everything, including the anesthesia, everything, all right? And do the transplantation there. And it's sad that China has been known for that. It's been in the news. Not only that, China was at one point also taking out vital organs from death row inmates without their consent. And even there was a news a few years back that the government says, oh, no, we're no longer doing that. What does that mean? We're no longer doing that, right? Okay, but it's there. So it's known, these are rogue countries. Sometimes the countries don't know, all right? But this whole team comes in and it's amazing. Again, we can't expect everyone to have the same value system that we have, but there will be medical doctors and nurses and everything else. You don't need that many, you know, just a skeleton crew to do the transplant, and they're being paid sweet royally for do this, and they're known in what is known as the dark web. Never going to the dark web, okay? It is the pits. But it's called transplantation tourism. It's known. Every now and then it rears its ugly head and the news picks it up, but it's there. It's in the background. And of course, it leads to the whole issue of organ trafficking, right? Which is also very closely associated with human trafficking. Okay, so that's all this part of the dark web scene that is very much in our contemporary society. Different is this whole issue from opt-in or opt-out. And this is an interesting concept, opt-in or opt-out. Consider this. So like I said earlier, we have an opt-in situation whereby we voluntarily will have to state somewhere, either verbally or in writing, that we want to be organ donors, all right? Either when we die or even living. So that's called the opt-in system, that we opt into donating. Opt-out is totally the opposite. To presume that everyone who dies would want to donate. And so they would harvest the organs from the cadavers that are candidates, because not every organ from every cadaver is going to be a candidate, right? depending on how they died and so forth, and how long they've died. But assuming that they qualify, the system would be that everyone in society knows that unless I opt out, my organs will be harvested when I die. And the big argument in favor of that, of course, is what are you doing with your organs in the grave, right? If they're still functional and someone else can live with those organs. You can literally save the life of someone else. If I die from something that is unrelated, again, trauma to the heart, to the brain, basically from the neck down, everything will still be functional. So why take those organs to the grave when you can save lives of other people, all right? In fact, even several lives and so forth, and that would wipe out a lot of the waiting lists. So that's the argument there. It is very altruistic, but it's altruistic at the general population, at the population level, not individually, okay? And so that has been proposed in a number of countries in Europe, in particular. Again, kind of consistent with a socialized medicine that has that the social milieu is foremost and the common good is highlighted and so forth, right? So advantages or disadvantages, what do you people think? Would you think that an opt-out system would work, for example, in the US? You know, it'd have to be generalized. It would have to be the whole population that knows this. So you think about it, it would require tremendous education, starting with the children, that this is what is expected of society, right? That when we die, our organs will be harvested. So everyone is really on board. There would have to be a lot of laws, I guess, implemented to avoid lawsuits and things like that, right? But I don't know, what do you think? It's an open question. Yeah, right. It's idealistic, it's interesting. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's from that perspective, it's a waste, right? It's a waste of organs, assuming, of course, that it qualifies. For example, one thing that disqualifies a person from donating right away is cancer. Any type of cancer, simply because of the risk that one cancerous cell, you know, went into the good organ, into the healthy organ, and spoiled it, and now the recipient will get cancer through that healthy organ, say. All right, so that's one thing that disqualifies a number of illnesses and diseases that will disqualify any number of people. But still, after we do all that arithmetic, it is logical to conclude that many people are dying with the organs, a number of their organs still healthy, even non-vital organs like cornea and so forth, all right, that can serve another person or a number of persons. So I think there's a lot of merit to it, frankly, but like you say, it's all in the implementation, how to make this happen. It's not gonna work in a society that will be, well, first of all, to me, the big danger here is ignorance, right? Ignorance will make people typically say no.
The day that this so much as gets mentioned, right, in politician anymore, you can bet that it will conspiracies for people.
Right, exactly. That's political suicide. Any politician who promotes this kind of opt-out. Yeah. Again, like I say, in Europe, it's getting some traction. Ironically, they tend to be the countries also that are okay with euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, even pushing it a little forward into involuntary physician-assisted suicide. You know, so the waters get very murky. Is it being done out of a very utilitarian mentality that not only are we going to kill this person because their lifestyle is no longer significant, right? They have very poor lifestyle or in pain, etc. And then we can, by the way, we can use the organs also for somebody else. So to link the two is very, very dangerous, of course. I think it gives a bad reputation to opt out. But in principle, it really is kind of a waste to see that now that we have the technology where transplantation is becoming more and more successful, all the vital organs that are being wasted in the grave, right? So I don't know, it's open-ended. It would be interesting, and to me, it would be encouraging to see if a society will move in this direction of the opt-out. But I want to say, at least in principle, from principle bioethics, we would be okay with opt-out, as long as a number of provisions are in place. Obviously, it would have to still be totally voluntary, and there would also have to be a campaign done to encourage people to make the decision if they want to opt out, you know, to write somewhere, maybe there could be national registries or polls or something, forms where the person could state, no, I don't want my organs harvested. When I die, leave me alone, put my whole body inside, or cremate me. That's another one, you know, you cremate, that's the end of that. That's it, absolutely. So anyway, I think it would have to be nationwide campaign, education, and also in the adult population to make sure that everyone is on board with it. All right, but I don't know, maybe a little too altruistic or optimistic. People online, any comments on the opt-in, opt-out? Let's see. No? No comments? Okay. All right, well, got 10 minutes. So I'll tell you a little anecdote. So I'm a living kidney donor, actually. Yeah, I did. I did. It was, let me see, it's been about 14 years now. It was 2007, I think it was, 2007, yeah. It was a parishioner, a friend of mine, and she had a very complicated medical history. I had a stroke and many other issues with her life. And she was taking care of her mother, her elderly mother, and young kid on her own. Just and with a stroke, hemiplegic, meaning that only half of the body really functions well, one hand to do everything. And she had already had 2 transplants, 2 kidney transplants, both cadaveric. The first one lasted for about 15 years, actually, twice as long as the average cadaveric kidney lasts about 7 or 8 years, average. Okay? And hers lasted longer, but eventually that gave up. And then the second one was not a good match from the start. And within a couple of years after the second transplant, which was also cadaveric, she was already on dialysis again. And that went on for several years, but 3 more years. And the dialysis, that's why I know a little bit about dialysis. It was very debilitating for her. And imagine all of these responsibilities that she had at home, dealing with a stroke, the consequences of a stroke, and then dialysis, one day on, one day off. I mean, it was totally the pits for her. I felt so bad. And just from my biological background, I knew that at least in principle, one could give a kidney and still keep living. So I said, well, why not? I said, walk the talk, right? As I say, walk the talk and let's see what happens. Of course, I didn't tell her anything at first because no sense encouraging a person if there's no match. And I knew that her transplants had been here at Jackson in Miami. So I called the Jackson Center, the Jackson Transplant Center, and I asked, I told them the scenario without mentioning any name necessarily. I said, look, I'd be willing to consider being a donor, but I want to make sure that there's a match first before saying anything, because otherwise, what if she gets all excited and then there's no match, right? It's horrible. So bottom line, my question to them was, could you do the PRA? Could you do my whole serum analysis? And since you have her PRA on record already because of the 2 previous transplants, see if there's a match and then let me know, and we'll go from there. And they said, fine, we'll do that. So they sent it to me. In fact, at that time, I was actually living in Philadelphia. They sent me by mail. It was about 10 test tubes. And the parish where I was at in Philadelphia, there was a Filipino community there. And the Filipinos, you know, are very good in nursing. They have their nursing schools in Filipino, both women and men, male nurses. Apparently the Filipino nursing schools get certified and they will come over here, they have a job right away. They don't need to revalidate their studies or anything like that. Okay, so there are quite a few Filipino nurses in the United States. Anyway, this community of Filipinos, there were a number of nurses there, and I asked if any one of them could draw the blood for me to send the samples back. And we did that one Sunday afternoon after Mass. We sat there in the rectory, and she drew the blood on all the vials. They were all heparinized, and she knew how to do all that, put it back in the box, in the return box. Not even, it was even styrofoam, but it was not cold pack or anything, just room temperature. Send it back to Jackson by mail. They ran the test and all that. And about a week later, they called me by phone and said, yeah, you're a match. It's not a perfect match. It's like a 3 out of 4, but you are a match. And it surprised me because her own mother was willing to donate and her own mother was not a match. Incredible, it can happen. So then I said, then finally I went to her and her family, right? I said, well, look, I did all this behind your back, but the truth is that we have a match, all right? And if you're willing, I'd be happy to donate a kidney. Not the 2, just 1. And at first she said, no way, I cannot, what am I going to do with a kidney of a priest and all this? They said, well, put it in prayer and let's see what happens. You know, I'll put it in prayer too. And then she went on a retreat. And then after that, she says, okay, well, if you're willing to do it, I'm willing to do it. And we'll go for it. It's here in town anyway. So all the recovery will be here. We both have great support system because she had family and friends. I had family and friends for all that. And we went through. But what I want to mention about the donation is that the donor also has to go through a rigorous protocol. Obviously, the recipient has to go through a protocol, all right? But the donor also, it includes not only a physical workup, I had to get certification, not only from my general practitioner, whom I've had for many, many years, but I also had to get a certification from a nephrologist, a urologist, and from a psychiatrist to see if, you know, I was insane enough to donate a kidney. And his question to me was on the psychological side, seriously, I thought that was interesting that they have a holistic approach to the donor and not just physiological, because see what happens is they're not going to risk the life of one patient to try to save the life of another patient. So the donor has to be healthy, very healthy to be able to donate. They're not going to risk the life of a donor who is not really healthy. But it includes the mental health. And the big question was, you know, what happens, how are you going to feel, what are you going to do if, let's say you go through the surgery, right? And the transplant, and a week or a month or a year later, she goes into rejection and she dies, and you wasted your kidney, you know? And that's how the psychiatrist placed it. And then he just waited for my answer. He says, oh my God, no, what a horrible mistake I did. Look at that, I lost the kidney and now, you know, she's dead. And maybe my kidney killed her. So he was waiting for the answer. He says, well, I said, doctor, first of all, I'm a priest, so I'm a man of faith, and the recipient is also a woman of faith. So we're all putting it in that context. If the good Lord wants it to work, it works. If it doesn't want it to work, then what can we do? You know, we can't force fate, but she was meant to die after the 3rd transplant, then that's it. What am I going to do? So I will accept it and just go forward and keep living. So here we are, 14 years later, she's alive, I'm alive, and it worked. This is good proof that it works. So the recovery was tougher for her. First of all, the surgery for her was about 12 hours because she had a lot of adhesions. This is another thing too. She actually has 5 kidneys now inside of her because the 2 nephrotic kidneys, they don't take out. They leave there in place. So no sense doing extra surgery for something that's not, it's not working, but it's not hurting her either, okay? So her 2 original kidneys, a kidney failure, it was mostly due to the, so the background medical history for her was high blood pressure to begin with from childhood. And then complicated with diabetes. And, I mean, it was incredible. So high blood pressure, you really have to monitor that and take care of it because the system can suffer. Anyway, they leave the 2 dead kidneys in place and they just add like the 3rd one and it's further down. It's near the abdominal region down here, okay? Much closer to the bladder. Also because with the kidney, whether it's living or cadaveric, the donated kidney, they take part of the ureter out. The ureter is the tube that is connecting the kidney to the bladder, right? It's kind of long because the kidneys are actually up here at the base of the, you can follow your rib cage, and it's at the base of the rib cage down. So it's pretty far up from the, it's not down in the belly region. It's way up there in the back, all right? The 2 kidneys. So there's a long tube, relatively long, that is the ureter. Right. You see? And since, let's say they're excising the kidney, oh, that's another thing, it can be done laparoscopically. It's amazing. For the left kidney. The right kidney not, because it's behind the liver. And so with the Da Vinci robot, they cannot displace the liver. That has to be done by hand. So to take out the right kidney is a traditional cut from side to side, all right? Traditional surgery. I'm talking about the donor. But if it's the left kidney that qualifies, then they can do it laparoscopically. And that's what they did on me. They took out the left kidney, so it was laparoscopic. It's a much less invasive surgery on the donor. Anyway, they take out a good section of the ureter because that ureter without a kidney is useless anyway. So no sense leaving it there. And they need that tubing for connecting to the bladder of the recipient. But so the installed, the transplanted kidney on the recipient will go near the bladder here in the abdominal region, okay? That's where they'll put it. There's more space down there in the viscera underneath the intestines and all that. So at this point, she's got her 2 necrotic kidneys. They kind of shrivel up. Asymptomatic there. She's got the 2 old kidneys that died and then the new one. But what does happen here is that over time, because of that extra kidney, then adhesions form, just scar tissue develops. And so they had to cut through all that very gently and so forth, and then do an anastomosis again for the sewing of this little tube onto the bladder. So long and short is that she was in surgery for about 12 hours. Long surgery, half a day. And they have several teams of doctors that come in. There's no one doctor can do that for 12 hours straight. In fact, there were 3 main kidney surgeons involved in this surgery. One who was on me, the other one who was on her, and then a 3rd kidney surgeon who literally transported my kidney to her, right? And was kind of standby in case there was a 3rd one needed in either one of the operations. On my side, the operation was only about 4 hours. And like I said, it was laparoscopic. In other words, they make 3 or 4 incisions. They make 3 incisions first on the abdominal region. And they put 3 tubes down there. One tube basically puts in CO2 gas, and they generate a chamber, an artificial chamber inside the abdominal region, which becomes like the other, the real surgical theater in there, right? They just generate a chamber with CO2. I mentioned, so it does bloat, yes. And that was, tell you about the recovery, talk about the recovery. That was one of the bigger issues of the recovery was that passing that CO2. Then the other tube, I think was a light. And the third tube is some kind of a catheter that works by ultrasound. And what that catheter does, it cuts and sears at the same time. So, and it's done with ultrasound. A very high frequency thing, it cuts through capillaries, but at the same time that it cuts, it's searing them and closing them up. So there's minimal blood spill, minimal. It's just amazing how much they've perfected this. And all this is being done on a screen, you know, at a distance by the surgeon. And it's the Da Vinci machine, like I've showed you here, inside, operating inside. They blow up the image 2 to 4 times the size so they can see. And that machine is very, very precise. It's amazing. They can move it microns. So much more precise than any hand surgeon could do. The fourth incision, the last one is the biggest one, and that's typically around the navel, all right? The belly button. And that incision only needs to be as big as the hand of the surgeon. Because finally, the surgeon needs to, the last thing that the surgeon needs to do once they have cut all the arteries and veins and the ureter and sealed all this up, etc., cauterized it, right? Now someone has to reach in there and pull the kidney out physically. The Da Vinci can do that, cannot do that. It's just too delicate for a machine to do that. So the surgeon literally has to reach in and pull out the kidney, all right? And so the one who did my surgery, Dr. Chan, she's Chinese Jamaican. And it's important that she was Chinese Jamaican because she's petite. And she has the small hands. And so there's that opening, I mean, it's to the level of that detail, that opening around the navel was the smallest possible just for her hand to fit in and reach out. So she's put normally on the donors because she's got the small hands. Isn't that amazing? The level of detail, because then that counts for the recovery. You know, that will recover faster the smaller the incision. But anyway, that's what it is. And for me, it was 3 days in the hospital. Then they kicked me out, and about another week or 2 at home, recovering. It's gradual improvement. Within 24 hours, I was walking the hallways already. Within 24 hours, they had me walking very slowly with all the IVs and all that, but I could already get up and walk. And I kept having 2 kinds of pain. One pain was on my shoulder up here, and the other pain was in the abdominal region, which I expected. The one on the shoulder I didn't expect. And it turns out that the one on the shoulder is because they put you on a prone position, and then they tie, I think it's the hand with the foot or something like that, because when we are under anesthesia, sometimes unconsciously, the arm does this. And of course, that would be disastrous if I do that to the machinery or to the surgeon. You know, if the patient unconscious under anesthesia is moving an arm involuntarily, that's a no-no. So they tie the hand back here like that so that that arm doesn't move, all right? And so that was causing that recovery pain there. I couldn't figure out. Once they explained it to me, I felt better. The other pain was abdominal from passing the gas, from passing the CO2, because they suck out as much CO2 as they can from the same tube that pushed it in. Then that becomes a vacuum and sucks out as much CO2 as possible, but they have to be careful not to start sucking out tissue and stuff. So at some point they stop the suction and they leave some gas inside. And of course, in the peritoneal region, in the abdominal region, one is not used to having gas there of any kind. And so that has to pass through the walls passively, has to be absorbed by the tissue and eventually pass through the body. Some will go to the intestines and out the backside, but others will just come out through the blood. So it has to go through the tissue passively being absorbed by the body. And that took some time, about a week to 10 days. So that was pain in the abdominal region that I never found very comfortable position back and forth, but eventually that did subside. And that was it. So her recovery was longer, again, because it was a more involved surgery, but she also recovered eventually and is alive and fine today. Doesn't take away all the, what we call the comorbidities, right? She still has a stroke and the consequences of all that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sorry? Yeah, still in her. As far as I know, still in her, and she's still alive. 13 years. 14 now, because it was in 2007, so that makes it 14. Coming up in, it was August or September of 2007, so coming up to 14 years. Yeah, as far as I know, everything is fine. Thanks for your dad. On that end, you know, she still has, the high blood pressure is a lifetime thing, and the diabetes is a lifetime thing, unfortunately, and the stroke consequences of that. But at least she got a new lease on life with that. Yeah, and as you can see, I'm still living my crazy lifestyle as ever, into the forest, climbing trees and doing crazy things. So I say, it hasn't slowed me down yet. It's amazing. You know, that's why I say, consider becoming a living kidney donor. Not yet. And I also say, so the time range, you know, the age is also a factor to consider. More for women than for men, because of course with one kidney that puts more stress on the circulatory system and the osmoregulating that the kidney does, osmoregulation. So it could increase high blood pressure and so forth, and pregnancy. And therefore, I don't recommend it for anyone less than maybe 50 years of age. Today, they're taking kidneys from living donors up until their 70s. They're still taking kidneys from living donors as long as they're healthy, or now in their 70s. So there's that window of about 24 years there, from the 50s to the 70s, when one could be a kidney donor. And when you think about it functionally, by the time we're in our 50s, we've basically established our lifestyle. If we were going to have children, we have the children already. The children are grown, they're adults, etc. You know, so I think that that could be a good time frame in which to consider being a kidney donor, a living kidney donor, from the 50s forward. If you're in good health, I think it's a very noble thing that can be done. Frankly, not because I did it, because it can be done. And again, considering there are 100,000 of these people on the list, and 15 are dying every day, you know. By the way, it doesn't cost anything for the donor, all right? Everything is paid for. So one doesn't have to pay, and don't expect any payments either. But it's totally for free on the donor. And in fact, insurance covers it, so for the recipient also. I mean, these are surgeries that amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars easily, but it's free on both sides if there is insurance there. Yep. Oh no, so as an organ donor? In fact, I'm an organ donor. I put it in my license. I put that in my license many, many years ago, okay? But while it's in the license, and the driver's license, is still kind of theoretical, because that assumes that it's cadaveric donation, right? In the driver's license. But this was living, it was not cadaveric, so it's anticipated. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
Tell you that you were a match.
Yes, correct. Yes, exactly. So they have to be careful with confidentiality there. I was the one who was putting forth the information, so I would not put them in a spot, all right, because I knew who she was. Yeah, I gave her name and so forth. And typically it's the name and the date of birth or something like that that they can trace, right, who it is, who is the patient. But yeah, they were willing to exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Exactly. HIPAA, they have to be careful. But this, you know, this is a county hospital, which depends a lot on public funds. So they're not going to risk their accreditation or certification for getting a donor, right? So they have to go by the book. But the book did allow them to do that for the match. Yeah. And I think it has to do with this whole thing of targeted donation. They have worked out a protocol that if someone comes forth like that, you know, as long as the recipient is not told anything yet, the confidentiality really is on their side. You know, if I violate the confidentiality, they cannot do anything about it, but it's on my conscience. But at least on the institutional side, they are bound to not violate that confidentiality until I give the okay. Once the donor gives the okay, then it's all systems go, right?
Even when they're confirming that she's a patient of theirs and that she's on the list, and that's even kind of.
Well,
But of course,
yeah.
It's a great thing they do.
Yeah. I don't know if today things have become more strict. At least that's the way it was in 2007. And
You have to get her to call us and hang up the phone.
Right.
I know, but they.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe today be more elaborate, or they may need her consent or something like that. But, yeah. Anyway, okay, so there it is for your consideration. Again, you guys are young, so you're safe by the bell, as it were. But consider it, you know, and also something you can talk about your family. It's another one of these conversations that is good to have, so that they know where you're at with regards to donation, and also they may consider being either cadaveric or living donor themselves. And that's all I have for today. So unless there are any questions, living or cadaveric, no, I mean living or virtual. Anyone from the virtual world? No? No? Okay, well, if there's nothing there, let me close the recording.